The letter arrived on Tuesday morning, carried by a rider whose horse was lathered with sweat, as though the message inside could not bear to wait another hour to be read. It came sealed in black wax, pressed with a crest of ivy and thorn, the mark of a house that had not sent correspondence to the village of Ashcombe Hollow in over 11 years. The housekeeper who received it did not recognize the seal at first. She only recognized the weight of it, heavier than paper should be, as though it carried something more than ink. By noon, the letter had reached the hands of the one person in England who did not wish to receive it. His Grace, Edmund Roswell, the 7th Duke of Aldermere. He read it once, standing near the tall windows of his London townhouse, the grey daylight falling across a face that had long ago mastered the art of revealing nothing. He read it a second time, more slowly, his jaw tightening at certain words, and when he finished, he did not speak. He simply folded the letter along its original crease, walked to the hearth, and held it above the flame for the length of 3 full breaths, before, at the very last moment, pulling it back. He did not burn it. He could not. Whatever the letter demanded of him, some old and buried sense of duty would not permit its destruction. The letter concerned a house. Not merely a house, a manor of grey stone and ivy-choked windows, standing at the edge of a valley where the mist rarely lifted before 10 in the morning. Hollowmere Manor. Once among the most admired estates in the county, its ballroom floors had hosted 3 generations of dancing, its gardens had been the pride of a duchess long dead, and its library had held books that scholars once travelled from Oxford merely to read. But for 11 years, Hollowmere had stood empty. Shutters closed, gates rusted shut. Ivy so thick upon the east wing that it had begun, in places, to pull the very stone apart. The Duke had ordered it left that way, deliberately. He had told his solicitor, his steward, and even his own mother, before her passing, that Hollowmere Manor was beyond saving. Some things, he had said once, in a rare unguarded moment, are better left to fall than to be dressed up in false hope. He believed the house carried something in its walls that no amount of restoration could undo. He was not a superstitious man. He did not believe in ghosts, curses, or the whispered nonsense of servants who claimed to hear footsteps in the locked east corridor. And yet he avoided Hollowmere as a man avoids a wound that has never properly healed. What the letter said, precisely, no servant would ever learn. But within a fortnight, an announcement appeared in the county paper, brief and without explanation. Hollowmere Manor was to be restored under commission of His Grace, the Duke of Aldermere. And a restorer was being sought, someone willing to take on a house that 3 separate architects had already refused. She did not yet understand what she was walking into. Her name was Miss Cassandra Wren, and she was 23 years old, and she had spent the last 2 years of her life learning, quite painfully, how quickly the world could take everything from a person who had once believed herself secure. Before the story continues deeper into the mystery of Hollowmere, if tales of old English manors, hidden letters, and quiet resilience are the kind of story that keeps you watching until the very last minute, take a moment now to subscribe to this channel so you never miss the next one. And while the mist begins to settle over the valley of Ashcombe Hollow, tell me in the comments below, where in the world are you watching from tonight? I read every single one. Now, let us return to Cassandra, and to the manor that no one believed could be saved. 3 years before the letter reached the Duke's hand, Cassandra Wren had lived a different life entirely. One of warm drawing rooms, of her father's steady laughter, of Sunday walks through gardens that were, if not grand, at least entirely her own. Her father, Mr. Theodore Wren, had been a respected architect in his own modest right, a man who restored the roofs and chimneys of the lesser gentry, never wealthy but always dignified. He had taught his daughter to read blueprints before she could properly read novels. He had taught her the names of stone, Portland, Bath, Purbeck. The way other fathers taught their daughters embroidery, she had grown up believing that a house, like a person, could be wounded and still be worth saving. Then came the winter that took everything. Her father's business partner, a man Cassandra had once called uncle, had made investments in her father's name without his knowledge, reckless ventures in railway speculation that collapsed within a single season. When the creditors came, they did not care that Theodore Wren had signed nothing willingly. They cared only that his name was on the papers. Within 4 months, the modest house was sold. Within 6, her father had taken ill. Whether from the shame or the cold nights spent in a smaller, damper lodging, no physician could say for certain, and by the following spring. Cassandra Wren was an orphan with no fortune, no house, and a small trunk of her father's architectural drawings that she refused, under any circumstance, to sell. She did not yet understand that this trunk of drawings, dismissed by every relative who offered her charity as a useless, sentimental burden, would one day be the very thing that saved her. For 2 years, she survived as a governess in the households of families who valued her less for her mind than for the reasonable price of her labour. She was quiet in a way people often mistook for meekness, though those who looked closer noticed the steadiness in her eyes, the eyes of someone who had already survived losing everything once, and was no longer afraid of losing it again. She wrote, in the evenings, long letters to no one, practice, she told herself, for the day she might again put her father's knowledge to use. She sketched staircases from memory. She calculated the load-bearing angles of roofs she would never be permitted to touch. She kept her father's compass in her pocket, worn smooth from her thumb passing over it during difficult nights. In her second household, she had been dismissed without warning when the lady of the house discovered her reading a treatise on structural masonry rather than embroidering, as though the ambition itself were an offence against propriety. In her third, she had endured the quiet cruelty of children who sensed, with the particular instinct of the young, that a governess without family or fortune could be mocked without consequence. She bore each indignity with the same steady composure, telling herself, on the coldest nights, that her father had endured worse and had never once let bitterness harden him. She would not be the one to break that inheritance, even as every other inheritance had been stripped from her. It was during her final position, in the household of a modest but kindly baronet's widow, that she first heard mention of the great estates scattered across the northern counties, houses fallen to ruin through neglect or misfortune, their families too proud or too grieved to admit the extent of their decline. The widow, in idle afternoon conversation, had spoken once of Hollowmere Manor by name, describing it as a house cursed by tragedy, a place decent people no longer spoke of in polite company. Cassandra had thought little of it at the time. She could not have known that within the year her own father's quiet legacy would carry her directly to its gates. What she did not know was that her father, in his final months, had once written to an old acquaintance, a solicitor in the north, describing his daughter's unusual gift for reading a building the way other people read faces. That solicitor, by strange and quiet coincidence, was the very man who now handled the affairs of Hollowmere Manor. When the notice appeared in the paper, a restorer sought for an estate that others had called hopeless. It was this solicitor, Mr. Aldous Finch, who thought immediately of the quiet young woman whose father had once written to him with such pride. Cassandra did not apply for the position out of ambition. She applied because the small announcement mentioned a modest stipend, room and board included, and because, for 2 years, she had eaten the bread of other people's charity and found it bitter in a way no one ever spoke of. She wrote her letter of application with trembling hands, attaching 3 of her father's old sketches as proof of her understanding, though she had, in truth, restored nothing herself. She was accepted within the week, with a brevity that surprised her. She would later learn that the Duke himself had not selected her. He had, in fact, been entirely unaware of her hiring until she arrived at Hollowmere's gates. What remained hidden was far more dangerous than a simple matter of neglected stonework. In the final days before her departure, Cassandra sold the last item of any true value she still possessed, a small cameo brooch that had belonged to her mother, one of the only possessions to survive her family's ruin. She told herself it was a practical decision, the coin needed for the journey and for a single respectable travelling dress, since her employers would expect a restorer to arrive looking capable rather than destitute. But as she watched the pawnbroker fold the brooch into a velvet cloth and hand her a small purse of coin in return, she felt something close, finally, quietly, upon her old life. Whatever waited for her at Hollowmere Manor, she understood there could be no returning to what she once was. There was only forward. She packed her father's trunk of drawings with more care than she packed her own clothing, wrapping each sketch in tissue paper as though it were something living that might be bruised by rough handling. Among them was an unfinished drawing her father had made in his final winter, a study of a great manor house he had never named, its east wing rendered only in faint pencil, as though he had lost the strength to finish it before his illness took him entirely. Cassandra had never understood why he had begun that particular sketch, nor why he had labelled it, in his careful hand, only with the words for "see" when she is ready. She placed it at the very top of the trunk, where she might see it first each morning, and told herself it was merely sentiment. She did not yet understand that her father's hand had once, many years before his ruin, been employed to survey the very estate she was now travelling toward, a fact erased so thoroughly from the family's records that not even the Duke himself was aware of it. The carriage that carried Cassandra toward Hollowmere Manor travelled for the better part of 2 days, the roads growing narrower and the hedgerows thicker, until at last the valley opened before her, like a held breath, finally released. She saw the manor first through a gap in the trees, grey and vast, its towers rising above a fog that clung stubbornly to the lower fields even at midday. Ivy had swallowed nearly the entire east wing. Several of the upper windows were shattered, their frames black, with old smoke damage that no one had explained to her. The main gate hung, crooked upon a single hinge, and beyond it, an avenue of ancient oaks stood like silent witnesses, their branches meeting overhead in a canopy so thick it turned afternoon into evening. No one in the house spoke of what had happened here 11 years ago. She would learn, in time, that the fire that scarred the east wing had taken more than stone and timber. It had taken, according to the vague and reluctant whispers of the 2 remaining servants, a young woman named Miss Iris Roswell, the Duke's own sister, whose name was never spoken aloud within these walls, whose portrait had been removed from the gallery, and whose room in the east wing had been locked, untouched, for over a decade. Cassandra did not yet understand that she had just stepped into a story far larger than crumbling stone. Her first days at Hollowmere were spent simply learning the shape of the house, for a manor of such age was never merely a building, but a living record of every decision made and undone across generations. She walked the ground floor first, tracing the water stains along the drawing room ceiling to a broken gutter above, noting the particular greenish bloom of damp that told her rot had crept further into the joists than any casual glance would reveal. She catalogued the great hall's cracked flagstones, the warped oak of the grand staircase, the broken hinge of a door that led, she was told firmly by Mrs. Pruitt, nowhere of any importance. Cassandra had learned long ago, from her father, that a servant who insists too quickly upon a door's unimportance is usually the servant who knows precisely how important it is. She did not press the matter that first week. Instead, she observed. She noticed that Mrs. Pruitt always found some errand that carried her past the east corridor twice daily, at the very same hours, as though drawn there by habit rather than duty. She noticed that old Samuel, despite his advancing years, insisted upon tending the western rose wall alone, refusing even her offer of assistance with a firmness that seemed almost protective. She noticed, too, that the Manor's account books, which she had been given leave to examine, in order to understand what funds might be available for repair, contained gaps. Not errors, precisely, but silences. Months in certain years, where income from tenant farms simply vanished from the ledger's careful columns, only to reappear the following season, as though nothing at all had happened. She did not yet understand what those silences meant. But she began, quietly, to copy the suspicious entries into her own private notebook, the same worn notebook in which her father had once recorded the measurements of lesser roofs. It was in the second week that she found the first true crack in the house's careful silence. A servant's stair, hidden behind a wardrobe in a disused nursery, its existence marked on no surviving plan of the house. She found it entirely by accident, having leaned against the wardrobe to study a water stain upon the nursery ceiling, only to feel the whole heavy piece of furniture shift unexpectedly beneath her weight. Behind it, a narrow door, its hinges surprisingly free of rust despite 11 years of supposed neglect, evidence, though she did not yet grasp its meaning, that someone had continued to use that stair long after the rest of the house had been abandoned to dust. She did not descend it that day. She was, if she was honest with herself, afraid of what she might find in a house already so thick with unspoken grief. But she returned 3 days later, candle in hand, and it was there, in the small hidden room below, that she found the child's writing desk, the pressed flowers, and the diary that would change everything she believed she understood about Hollowmere Manor. Even before she opened its cover, she noticed the initials pressed into its worn leather binding, IR, and felt, with the peculiar certainty restorers sometimes develop toward the buildings they come to know intimately, that she had found something the house itself had been waiting a very long time for someone to discover. The diary was not the only secret the Manor offered that week. In the chapel adjoining the west wing, long since deconsecrated and used only for storage, Cassandra found a stack of correspondence addressed to the late Duchess, tucked behind a loose panel near the altar, letters from a physician in London, written in the months before the fire, expressing concern over a matter he described only obliquely as the arrangement her ladyship wishes kept from his. Grace's notice. No name was given, no explanation offered, only a final letter, dated a mere week before the fire, in which the physician wrote that he could no longer, in good conscience, continue concealing a truth of such consequence, and urged the Duchess to confess it herself before matters were taken entirely out of her hands. What that truth might have been, Cassandra could not yet say, but she began to suspect that the fire which had scarred the East Wing had not been a single tragedy at all, but the collision of several long-buried secrets, each one striking against the others until the whole fragile arrangement of silence finally caught flame. She thought of her own father and the silence that had surrounded his ruin, how a single hidden signature, a single secret arrangement made without his knowledge, had been enough to destroy an honest man's entire life. She began to understand, walking those cold corridors, that Hollowmere Manor's wounds were not so different from her own. Both had been left to rot, not from any fault of their own making, but because those with the power to speak the truth had chosen, instead, the comfort of silence. She resolved, quietly and without informing anyone, that she would not leave Hollowmere Manor as silent as she had found it. The Manor's remaining staff consisted of only two, an elderly housekeeper named Mrs. Pruitt, whose hands trembled faintly whenever she passed the east corridor, and a groundskeeper named Old Samuel, who tended a garden that had, against all odds, refused entirely to die. Roses still blooming wild and unpruned along a wall that should have long since been reclaimed by nettles and thorn. Cassandra noticed this immediately, on her very first walk through the grounds. A garden abandoned for 11 years should not still bloom with such stubborn, deliberate beauty. Someone had been tending it in secret. She said nothing of this observation at first. She had learned, in her 2 years of quiet service in other people's houses, that the fastest way to lose a position was to ask questions before you had earned the right to receive answers. Instead, she began her work as she had been instructed, surveying the manor's structure, room by room, drawing careful sketches of cracked foundations and water-damaged ceilings, cataloguing which portions of the house might yet be saved and which had truly passed beyond hope. It was patient, unglamorous work, and she performed it with the same quiet diligence her father had shown in every roof he had ever mended. Yet as the days passed, she began to notice things that no honest survey should have revealed. In the library, half collapsed under a fallen section of ceiling, she found a shelf of journals belonging to the late Duchess, the Duke's mother, their spines swollen with damp but their pages, remarkably, still legible. In the second week, hidden behind a loose stone in the old nursery fireplace, she discovered a bundle of letters tied with a ribbon, gone the colour of weak tea. Addressed not to the Duke, nor to his mother, but to a name Cassandra did not recognise at all, Miss Adelaide Cray. She did not yet understand who Adelaide Cray had been, or why her letters had been hidden inside a wall. What she did understand, with a certainty that unsettled her more than she wished to admit, was that Hollowmere Manor had not simply been abandoned out of grief. It had been abandoned the way a house is abandoned when someone wishes an entire chapter of a family's history to be forgotten. The Duke arrived at Hollowmere without warning, 11 days after Cassandra's arrival, his carriage cutting through the morning mist with the kind of silent authority that made even the ancient oaks along the drive seem to bow slightly lower. Mrs. Pruitt nearly dropped the tea service when she saw him descending from the carriage. He had not set foot on the estate in over a decade, and his sudden appearance seemed, to her superstitious mind, almost an omen. Cassandra was found in the West Gallery, on her knees, measuring the warp of a floorboard with her father's old compass, when the Duke entered the room without announcement. She rose quickly, brushing dust from her skirts, and found herself facing a man whose presence filled the room the way cold air fills an empty church, not loud, but undeniable. He was younger than she had expected, no more than 35, with the kind of severe, aristocratic handsomeness that seemed carved rather than born, a face that had learned, long ago, to give nothing away. His eyes moved over her only briefly before sweeping the ruined gallery with an expression of controlled, quiet contempt. "You are the restorer," he said. It was not a question. "Cassandra Wren, Your Grace." She curtsied, though her hands remained steady, holding her father's compass as though it were a shield. "Then you are wasting your time," he said, "and mine." He told her, in the cold and measured tones of a man accustomed to being obeyed without argument, that Hollowmere Manor was beyond restoration, that he had allowed the commission only as a courtesy to his late mother's final wishes, expressed in a letter he had not intended to honour, and that he expected the project to fail as swiftly and as quietly as the 3 architects before her. "Some things," he said, echoing the words he had once spoken to his own steward, "are better left to fall than dressed up in false hope." Cassandra, who had spent 2 years swallowing her opinions in the households of lesser men, found something in his certainty that struck a nerve long buried beneath her own losses. "Your Grace," she said quietly, "I have seen houses that looked far worse than this one, restored to something greater than they were before their ruin. A house is not beyond saving, simply because a man has stopped looking at it." For a moment, something flickered behind the Duke's cold composure, not warmth, but a kind of startled recognition, as though no one had spoken to him so plainly in a very long time. He said nothing further. He turned and left the gallery and did not speak to her again for 11 days. She did not yet understand that his coldness toward the manor was not disdain at all, but grief wearing armour. The days that followed brought discoveries that no ordinary restoration should have uncovered. In the East Wing, which Cassandra had been expressly forbidden to enter, though the lock upon its door was old and poorly maintained, she found, quite by accident, a door behind a wardrobe that led to a narrow servant's stair no longer marked upon any surviving floor plan of the house. Down this stair, in a room untouched by fire or time, she found a child's writing desk, a collection of pressed flowers gone the colour of old parchment, and a diary belonging to Miss Iris Roswell, the Duke's vanished sister. Its final entries dated only days before the fire that had scarred the wing above. The diary spoke, in the trembling handwriting of a frightened young woman, of a marriage being arranged against her wishes to a cousin of considerable debt named Lord Pemberton, a man the diary described with unmistakable dread. It spoke of a locked box containing documents Iris had discovered, proof, she believed, that Lord Pemberton had been forging signatures upon estate papers to divert Hollowmere's income into his own failing accounts. It spoke of her intention to bring these documents to her brother, the young Duke, before the fire had claimed the wing, and, according to the official account the family had always given, claimed Iris herself. But no body had ever been recovered. Cassandra sat in that hidden room for a long while, the diary trembling in her hands, understanding at last why the roses in the garden still bloomed as though tended by unseen hands, why old Samuel's eyes grew damp whenever he passed the East Wing, why Mrs. Pruitt trembled at the mere mention of a name no longer spoken in this house. Iris Roswell had not died in that fire. She had disappeared, and someone at Hollowmere had known it for 11 years and said nothing. Years later, the truth would emerge in full, but even now, piece by careful piece, Cassandra began assembling what she had found. She matched the handwriting in the hidden letters, those addressed to the mysterious Adelaide Cray, against the handwriting in Iris's diary, and found them to be one and the same hand, disguised under an assumed name. Adelaide Cray, she realised with a chill, was Iris Roswell herself, writing in secret correspondence to someone she trusted enough to hide her true identity. Someone, Cassandra now suspected, who still lived quietly within reach of the estate. She began to watch old Samuel more closely. She noted the particular tenderness with which he pruned the roses along the forgotten wall, roses, she now understood, planted by Iris's own hand as a girl. She noted that he always left a small offering of bread upon the sill of a gatehouse cottage at the edge of the western woods, a cottage the estate records listed as abandoned, yet whose chimney, on cold mornings, showed the faintest trace of smoke. No one in the house spoke of it, but Cassandra began to suspect that Iris Roswell was not merely alive in memory. She was alive. What troubled Cassandra more deeply, however, was the second name she found threaded through the estate's old ledgers, a name appearing again and again beside suspicious transfers of income in the years just before the fire. Lord Pemberton, the very cousin the diary described with such dread, and a man who, she now discovered with growing unease, had written to the current Duke only weeks earlier, offering, with unusual eagerness, to purchase Hollowmere Manor outright, ruins and all, the moment restoration proved, as he confidently predicted, impossible. She did not yet understand how far Lord Pemberton was willing to go to ensure that prediction came true. The Duke returned to Hollowmere more frequently after that first cold visit. Though he told himself it was merely to monitor an investment he expected to fail, he found himself, against every instinct of his guarded nature, drawn into conversation with the quiet restorer whose sketches, week by week, revealed a house not merely repaired, but understood. Every crack explained, every water stain traced back to its true cause. Every collapsed beam replaced not with careless haste, but with the same patient logic her father had once brought to lesser houses. He began to notice things about her too, the worn compass she carried always in her pocket. The particular stillness in her expression when she believed no one watched her, a stillness he recognized because he wore the very same mask himself. He asked her, one grey afternoon in the half-restored library, why she had chosen a profession that offered a woman so little reward and so much labour. "Because a house remembers what people try to forget, Your Grace," she said, "and someone ought to listen to it." He did not answer her that day. But that night, for the first time in 11 years, he walked the length of the East Wing corridor alone and stood before his sister's locked door and did not enter, but did not turn away either. What remained hidden was far more dangerous than either of them yet understood, for Lord Pemberton had grown aware, through a servant in his own pay, planted quietly among Holomere's temporary workmen, that the young restorer had begun asking questions in the village, and searching rooms she had not been given leave to enter. He decided the time had come to ensure that Hollomere Manor's restoration failed by more than misfortune alone. There remained, even now, the matter of the physician's letters, hidden behind the loose panel of the deconsecrated chapel, the arrangement the late Duchess had wished kept from her son's notice. That truth, too, unravelled in the days that followed, though more gently than the rest. The Duchess, it emerged, had known of Lord Pemberton's mounting debts long before the fire, and had quietly lent him sums from her own private income, in an effort to spare the family the scandal of a relation's ruin, a kindness Pemberton had repaid, in the end, by forging the very signatures that nearly destroyed the estate she had tried to protect. The physician's concern had been for the Duchess's own failing health, strained by years of carrying a secret burden alone, rather than confessing it to a son she believed too proud, too rigid, to forgive a relation's weakness. It was a small tragedy folded inside the larger one, a mother's silence, meant kindly, that had nonetheless left her son to inherit a wound he did not even know he carried. The Duke listened to this final piece of the story with a stillness that Cassandra had come to recognize as his particular way of grieving. No tears, no outward collapse, only a long silence in which something old and heavy seemed, slowly, to loosen its grip upon him. "She thought me too hard a man to trust with the truth," he said quietly, more to himself than to Cassandra. Perhaps she was not entirely wrong to think it. She was wrong, Cassandra said, to believe that a hard exterior means an ungenerous heart. "I have watched you these past weeks, Your Grace. You are not a man without feeling. You are a man who has simply never been given leave to show it." He did not answer her then. But he did not walk away, either, and in the quiet that followed, something between them shifted, not yet spoken, but no longer entirely unspoken. The central truth, when it finally emerged, arrived not in a single dramatic confession, but in the quiet, cumulative weight of evidence Cassandra had gathered over long weeks of careful, unglamorous work, precisely the kind of truth that only patience, and not force, could uncover. It began with a fire, not the fire of 11 years past, but a new one, deliberately set, in the dead of night, in the very room where Cassandra had stored her father's drawings and her collected findings regarding the estate's ledgers. She woke to the smell of smoke and the frantic barking of old Samuel's dog, and though the fire was contained before it could spread beyond a single storeroom, the message was unmistakable. Someone did not wish her discoveries to survive the night. It was the Duke himself who found her standing in the smoke-stained doorway at dawn, her hands blackened from having pulled what papers she could from the flames, her face pale but resolute rather than frightened. And it was, in that moment, seeing her calm defiance against a danger she had not caused and did not deserve, that something in the Duke's carefully guarded composure finally broke. "Tell me everything," he said. "All of it." Now, and so, at last Cassandra told him of the hidden room behind the wardrobe, of his sister's diary, of the letters signed Adelaide Cray, of the smoke still rising twice a day. from a cottage the estate records insisted was empty, of Lord Pemberton's forged signatures upon the very ledgers that had, for 11 years, quietly bled Holomere's income into his failing accounts, and of his sudden, eager offer to purchase the ruined estate the very moment its restoration was declared beyond hope. The Duke listened in a silence so absolute that even the fire's dying embers seemed to hold their breath. When Cassandra finished, he said nothing for a long while. Then, without a single word of explanation, he walked from the room, crossed the length of the ruined gallery, and made his way toward the western woods, toward a gatehouse cottage he had not approached in 11 years. What he found there would connect every clue Cassandra had gathered into a single, unbearable truth. His sister was alive. She had survived the fire by escaping through the very servants' stair Cassandra had discovered, believing, in the terror and confusion of that night, that the documents proving Lord Pemberton's forgeries, and perhaps her own life, would not survive if her escape were known. She had hidden in the cottage under old Samuel's quiet protection ever since, writing secret letters under an assumed name to the one servant she trusted, waiting for a moment when she might safely reveal the truth without being silenced by the cousin who had, that very night, meant for the fire to claim more than a wing of the house. The Duke had believed his sister dead for 11 years. He had let the house fall into ruin because he could not bear to walk its halls and remember her. He had, without ever quite admitting it to himself, been punishing the Manor for a loss that was never truly the Manor's fault at all. Connected now, every earlier mystery resolved itself with the clean, sorrowful logic of a story finally permitted to be told in full. The forged ledgers, the fire meant to destroy evidence, and perhaps a girl who threatened to expose it. The roses tended in secret, the bread left upon a windowsill, the trembling hands of a housekeeper who had known the truth all along, and kept it, out of love, for 11 silent years. Lord Pemberton, informed by his planted servant that his forgeries had at last been discovered, did not wait to be formally confronted. He arrived at Holomere that very evening, uninvited, his composure fraying at the edges, demanding to know what falsehoods a mere restorer had been permitted to invent against a man of his standing. But the moment he entered the drawing room and saw, standing quietly beside her brother, the very woman he had believed dead for 11 years, his protests collapsed into silence more damning than any confession. Iris Roswell, thinner and greyer than the portrait once removed from the gallery, but very much alive, stepped forward and placed upon the table the very documents she had risked everything to protect, proof, in Lord Pemberton's own hand, of every fraudulent transfer he had made against the estate that was never his to claim. In the days immediately following Lord Pemberton's exposure, Holomere Manor seemed to hold its breath, as though the house itself were uncertain whether to believe that its long ordeal had truly ended. Mrs. Pruitt moved through the halls with a lightness Cassandra had not seen in her before, humming softly as she aired rooms that had stood shuttered for over a decade. Throwing open windows whose frames groaned in protest at being disturbed after so many silent years. Old Samuel wept openly, without shame, when Iris Roswell first walked the length of the rose wall herself, running her fingers along blooms she had once planted as a frightened girl of 19, never believing she would live to see them grown so tall and so wild in her long absence. The village of Ashcombe Hollow, too, seemed to exhale. For 11 years, the shuttered manor at the edge of the valley had been a quiet source of unease among the tenant families, a reminder of tragedy left unresolved, of a great house fallen silent for reasons no one dared ask aloud. Now, as scaffolding rose along the east wing and the sound of masons' hammers rang once more across the fields, the village found in Holomere's revival something of its own, proof, perhaps, that even the oldest grief need not remain permanent, that even a house long given up for lost might yet be called home again. Justice, when it came, arrived quietly, as such things often do in old English houses, more concerned with dignity than spectacle. Lord Pemberton's debts and forgeries were laid before the family solicitor, Miss Finch, and within the month his claims upon any portion of the Aldermere estate were extinguished entirely. His name quietly excised from society's guest lists in the particular, merciless way that only the aristocracy could manage without ever raising its voice. Iris Roswell returned to Hollowmere Manor not as a ghost reclaimed from rumour, but as its rightful mistress restored, her portrait returned to the gallery, her locked room finally opened to light and air for the first time in over a decade. She wept, quietly, when she saw the roses old Samuel had tended in her name every single day of her long hiding, and she embraced the old housekeeper who had guarded her secret at considerable personal risk, calling her, at last, by the title she had long deserved, friend, not merely servant. And Hollowmere Manor itself, room by careful room, rose from its long ruin under Cassandra Wren's patient hand. The east wing was rebuilt not to erase what had happened there, but to honour it, a small plaque set quietly into the restored stairwell, marking the courage of a young woman who had once nearly given her life to expose a truth others would have preferred buried forever. The library's damaged shelves were repaired, the Duchess's journals preserved and catalogued, the gallery's portraits cleaned of a decade's neglect, until the whole assembled family, living and dead, seemed at last to watch over the house with something closer to peace than sorrow. The Duke, in the months that followed, found himself changed in ways he could not entirely explain, even to himself. He walked the restored halls of Hollowmere, not as a man avoiding old wounds, but as one finally willing to remember them, without flinching. He found, too, that his conversations with the quiet restorer who had uncovered his family's truth had become the part of each day he anticipated most, though it would be some while yet before either of them spoke aloud what both had long since privately understood. Cassandra Wren, who had arrived at Hollowmere with nothing but her father's compass and 2 years of swallowed grief, left it, though in truth she never fully left it again, as the restorer whose name would, within a year, be spoken of respectfully in circles that had once dismissed a woman's understanding of architecture as an amusing eccentricity. She had proven, in the end, precisely what she had once told the Duke in that cold, ruined gallery, that a house is never truly beyond saving, so long as someone remains willing to listen to what it has been trying, quietly, to say all along. The Duke offered her, eventually, more than a professional commission, a permanent place within the household, overseeing not only Hollowmere's continued restoration, but the care of every property under the Aldermere name, a position no woman had held in the family's long history. He made the offer one autumn evening in the restored library, the shelves once more lined with the Duchess's recovered journals, the fire in the hearth burning steady and warm where once only damp and silence had lived. He did not phrase it as a matter of business alone, though he was careful, in his old habit of restraint, not to say more than the moment allowed. This house, he told her, has taught me that the things worth keeping are rarely the ones that come easily. I would not see you leave it, Miss Wren, nor, if I am honest, would I see you leave at all. She accepted, not out of ambition, but because she had learned, at Hollowmere, that some ruins are not endings at all, but simply chapters waiting, patiently, for someone brave enough to turn the page. In the years that followed, Hollowmere Manor became known throughout the county, not merely for the tragedy that had once darkened its name, but for the quiet, remarkable manner of its recovery, spoken of in drawing rooms as far as London as the house that refused, against every expectation, to remain a ruin. Young architects wrote to Cassandra requesting her methods, curious how a restorer with no formal training and no fortune to her name had succeeded where 3 trained men had failed. She always gave the same answer, modest and unchanging, that she had done nothing more than her father had taught her, to listen to a house before attempting to correct it, to understand its wounds before presuming to heal them. Iris Roswell, in time, married a quiet clergyman from the neighbouring parish, a man who had known her only as Adelaide Cray during her long years in hiding, and who loved her still, without hesitation, once her true name and history were finally restored to her. She remained close to Hollowmere all her life, tending the rose wall herself each spring alongside old Samuel, until the old groundskeeper's own passing many years later, mourned by the entire household as though he had been family all along, which, in every way that mattered, he had been. The Duke, in time, softened in ways that surprised even those who had known him longest, not into a different man entirely, for his quiet reserve never fully left him, but into a man who had finally made peace with the grief he had spent 11 years refusing to name. He walked the restored halls of Hollowmere each morning before breakfast, a habit Cassandra teased him for gently, calling it his own private ritual of remembering. He no longer avoided the East Wing. He walked it freely, and often, and in time. He came to think of it not as the place where his family's sorrow had begun, but as the place where its healing had finally been permitted to start. The mist still gathers over the valley of Ashcombe Hollow some mornings, settling along the restored gardens and the newly gleaming windows of the East Wing. But those who pass along the drive now speak of Hollowmere Manor not as a house of tragedy, but as a house of quiet endurance, a story preserved in the patient memory of an old English estate, waiting, as such places always do, for someone willing enough to listen. And somewhere within its walls, a single rose still blooms each spring along a forgotten garden wall, planted long ago by a girl who never stopped believing that even the most broken things might yet find their way home.